have always been places of teaching, learning and research. And I want to acknowledge all the Indigenous participants in the forum. I saw Ren was there. So Ren, my acknowledgement to you as an Indigenous scholar and teacher to us and any other Indigenous people in the group. Over to Asiphe. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Paulo, and thank you very much for this invitation. Let me start sharing my screen. I'm not sure if you can see it.
Yeah,
yes, we can.
Perfect.
And also to show you my face. So good afternoon to everyone who's in Australia and the world. And on our side, it is unfortunately morning. So good morning to the South African people that have just joined us this morning. My name is Asiphe Mxalisa, as introduced. And while I stand before you today, I carry with me the spirit of my ancestors and the strength of my clan being Amambehle, Odede, Otabashe, Ongomozibomvu. I honor the legacy of my lineage from my mother's side as well, Ojola, Ompangomo, and I offer this brief prayer to recognize the roots that have shaped me. I am who I am today because of the love and the support of my people. Tamago, which often means amen, which often means let it be done. So that is the tone that I am setting for this presentation today, which looks at the use of narrative inquiry as a decolonial methodology in social justice research, which is the research that I am currently doing. So we are having this conversation today in the midst of many global issues, calling for academics to act and for research to shift. We are in an era where we are facing, or rather experiencing, a significant transition akin to what Gramsci referred to as an interregnum, characterized by morbid symptoms indicative of a period where the old is in decline while the new has not yet fully emerged. I believe clearing what we mean by decolonizing research as we move along with our contribution matters. So I center my contribution in the belief that decolonization is indeed a way of life and a project of love. And in my language, it's a Xhosa love. We refer to it as uthando. So my presentation today is a research journey of myself and my collaborators, which is a word I'll be using a lot in my presentation. So I refer to what we usually term participants as collaborators, and I'll tell you why, who helped shape the way in which they would like their stories to be told and to be shared. So the journey of decolonizing methodology is a journey I started through my doctoral project, which looks at student experiences of gender in higher education post mass fall movements and during COVID-19. As much as I won't get into detail with regards to the mass fall movements, for a sense of reference, mass fall movements were movements that started in South Africa in 2015, which started in the area because of the issue of fees rising in higher education, but more so it became a lot of intersectional hashtags about patriarchy, about gender-based violence must fall, as well as about racism falling, and hence there was a lot of falls of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes. But for the purposes of time, we are not going to be talking about that history a lot today. And we all know the context of during COVID-19. So my PhD locates higher education based on what happened post those two huge contexts, the one being mass fall, as well as the other one being COVID-19, which actually exposed more inequalities and issues of social justice in South African university system. So where do we locate the stories of students in that space? So what captured my interest in research was the idea of knowledge creation and co-creation. As I come from a family with no formal education, having to be the first to go to university and knowing that through research, I could have more impact and cement not only myself, not only my family's name, but also the students that are like me, telling their stories, archiving their experiences. So a moment to archive and be part of the bigger project of knowledge creation was one of the reasons why I chose to do postgraduate studies. But what is knowledge creation in a university? And that is physical and the social space of the university. I see knowledge creation in the eyes of Professor Andre Kitt from Nelson Mandela University as the space of critique. In one of his work, he asked a critical question of what is the fundamental role of critique in a university? The fundamental role of critique in university education ought to be a central intellectual endeavor. It ought to evolve, it ought to grow. Critique ought to foster open, reflective, and proactive dialogues that have the potential to influence societal interaction within and beyond the academic setting. Critique is essential for functioning of the university as a public sphere in the public community. But can that critique be of the university itself with its systems, its layers and research bureaucracies that foster ways students ought to do research, or better yet, tools to use in that research? So what is a university as a space of co-creation? What do we even mean in research when we are saying we are co-creating in spaces that were not built with co-creation in mind, such as a space called the university? The concept of co-creation is employed across various disciplines, such as therapy and production, with its probable origins traced back to the therapeutic domain, where it denotes the collaborative generation of significance during therapeutic interactions. A unifying element in this context is the notion of mutual participation or collaboration, which is a process of learning, unlearning, and relearning. Now, as an academic who is also in grief therapy, I often use dark humor in sessions, and I'm not sure how my therapist feels about that. But to me, humor is part of collaboration, but also humor can be problematic. So we'll leave it to my therapist. I've always thought that all conversations, unrest, and chaos in the university was due to the fact that the university does indeed not have a heart, as it was built on a project of hate, from the colonizers' list of projects to capture systems and create hierarchical structures that can be controlled in one central place. While there's some truth to that, my perspective shifted after participating in a workshop at Nelson Mandela University, organized by the Critical University Studies think tank this past June. We engaged in a lively debate about the essence of the university, and it sparked a revelation in me. I've chosen to pursue research, particularly this research, because I've come to believe that the university indeed possesses a heart. But what kind of heart is it? And what truly lies at the core of that heart? What is my contribution to that heart of that university as an establishment, scholarship, and social environment? Well, that is one reason and choice for me to do my PhD project, where such questions allows me to sit with the discomfort of doing the decolonial project of love, something many academics feel uncomfortable to be in a position to sit with the discomfort of doing the decolonial project of love or being part of the project of love, the project of trying to undo the colonial project of hate, discrimination, and Eurocentrism. The exploration of social justice serves as a powerful call to deconstruct the settler's town. Dr. Pedro Mxalisa eloquently reflects on the concept of the student city as a settler's town in Africa, drawing inspiration from Fanon's insights. His writings urge us to engage with this history thoughtfully and critically, but most importantly, to reflect and engage what type of researchers do we want to be. So what type of a researcher do I want to be? The first thing was to recognize the impact that this research will do, not only to myself, but also to the collaborators that I work with. What I did was the most important thing of putting a human behind the researcher. And that is locating myself, locating my story as a human being behind the researcher, meaning being in tune with my emotions, being in tune with my inner itch, the reason why I decided to do this project. But most importantly, to archive the voices of the marginalized in South Africa. The history of colonialism came with a lot of silencing of marginalized group, previously marginalized group. So now what we're trying to do is to come up with projects and also to awaken projects that actually archive the voices of the marginalized and the great work that is being done, particularly by Black people. I am also a feminist killjoy, but also I am a feminist celebrator of joy, a feminist celebrator of great things that are being done, particularly in my work by Black women. I also rewrite history pertaining to the work that I am doing and also ways in which I am doing research. But also it was important for me to become a researcher so that I can create accessible knowledge in terms of language, in terms of accessibility, in terms of co-creation. But to also cement my own story as I continue navigating my positionality in academia as a Black woman who's also young, coming from the background that I come from. That's the path to decolonizing methodology in my project. I have been more interested in the work as Professor Mxalisa. My co-supervisor has been inviting me to engage with her on the project of decolonizing supervision and methodology. The work we have presented in some universities, including VU in Amsterdam, UJ, University of Johannesburg, and soon in a policy dialogue with the Embassy of the Netherlands. I'll share those details later. So research methodologies, which are an integral part of social research, particularly one that deals with the realities and livelihood of people. The way in which we do research matters. Whose methodology is it anyway? The overemphasis on westernized methodologies necessitates a re-evaluation of Eurocentric norms in research practices. This entails the integration of transformative, collaborative, and participatory approaches that align with the values and the needs of the individuals or organizations with whom researchers are collaborating with. Supervisors play a crucial critical role in fostering and empowering students to adopt innovative research methodologies. I would not have done the work that I'm doing today without the support of my supervisors, Dr. Kirsten Wilmot, as well as Professor Mxalisa. And that means supervision is very important because sometimes effective ways to engage with research are already at our fingertips. However, many postgraduate students hesitate to explore these options due to their apprehension about the university's bureaucratic and Eurocentric standards, which often dictates the research process. Better yet, having preconceived ideas of what research ought to be. As a result, they overlook these potential methods that could lead to remarkable outcomes in their research and also lead to their research being impactful, such as the practice of conversation, plain and simple. How do you have conversations with people? So I argue and I incorporate this idea of okunokola in communities. Okunokola, which is a Xhosa term that means conversation, which corresponds to semi-structured interviews in research terminology. Why not have conversations with your research collaborators instead of interviews, which have got some intimidating power dynamics, especially when one does social research? And I will share about the methods and methodology of okunokola later on as I speak about narratives. So various scholars such as Napudere challenge the concept of Eurocentric knowledge by examining the appropriation of human and material resources and exploring the dynamics of extraction versus collaboration within communities during research endeavors. Do we have trainings that trains researchers, postgraduate students, on how they can co-create and collaborate as they go to the field? Do we even have spaces for debrief for researchers who go there and panic, which is one of the things that happens in the field, and they struggle to interact with the people in the field? The time constraints of conversations. Are there debrief spaces for postgraduate students to debrief about their experience of being part of the field outside the archival or journaling? Conversely, Barnes discusses decolonizing methodologies as an attempt to bring together a number of critical indigenous liberation and feminist methodologies to strengthen decolonizing research. Decolonizing research methodologies involve the transformation of knowledge creation and co-creation processes, a process of unveiling hidden truths and fostering resistance. For instance, feminist works focusing on the intellectual histories of African women, which is work that is also done at the Center for Women in Gender Studies at Nelson Mandela University, but also exemplified by the contributions of Professor Asiphe Mxalisa, looking at community studies of informal economies and co-authoring with her collaborators. This is one example of archival and collaborative projects in this context. And the recent project by various authors in a book edited by Kimberly Crenshaw, Kehindri Andrews, and Annabelle Wilson, titled Blackness at the Intersection, offering narratives at different parts of the world and how intersectional their experiences are. Abongile Sonkosi and I reviewed this book, and our publication came out earlier this year. There is a chapter there where the authors are the people who are telling their own story, and that chapter is written by a researcher and her mother. One thing I loved engaging with narrative methodology is that it centers the personal as political. The concept that the personal is political, which had a significant impact on the second wave feminism, is influenced the evolution of social analysis and theories, fostered novel forms of activism, and broadened the range of concerns that could be categorized as feminist issues. The idea of the personal is political represented a significant shift, demonstrating the interconnectedness of the personal and political matters and the reciprocal influence they have on each other. By virtue of collaborating with individuals in our research is therefore political as the individual is political. We can argue about researcher objectivity, but I believe the personal is political, and there's a personal itch that leads people to do their social research. In the South African context, particularly given its historical background, the intersection of personal and political dimension is evident, particularly when examining higher education institutions that continue to operate within the colonial legacies of systematic exclusion, which directly impacts students on personal political level. To understand the personal that is political, Narratives utilizes the process of storing as well as restoring. So intersectionality through experience-centered narrative approach has been the center of my methodology. So in my research, I utilize the experience-centered narrative approach, where narrative methodology becomes a complex but also a free form of methodology to experiment with and also to create participatory methods as well as collaborative methods. In addition to the types of narrative research, there are many factors to be considered when using this type of methodology, which is narrative. These include how narrative construct identities, viewing identity as an ongoing and performative process in which individuals draw on diverse resources to deconstruct selves. However, it is important to note that identities are constructed in the narratives we create and tell about ourselves, including how we externalize ourselves to ourselves and to others. This means that people construct narratives and narratives construct people, and our identities emerge through these processes. As such, making identity construction a big part of understanding student experiences through their told stories was important in my PhD study. And as a reminder, my PhD looks at student experiences of gender in higher education post #massful movements and during COVID-19 era. So to understand, another factor to be considered is number 2, narratives can be used as a tool of knowledge gathering and knowledge sharing. Whose knowledge is it? Who brings the knowledge? Is it the researcher? Is it the collaborators? Or is it the collaboration of both? There is so much power in personal narratives, especially in the higher education space, as a tool to aid education by raising awareness on the different systems that many navigate, which can be often neglected and also contribute to the needed systematic changes through responses to a story that is told or shared. To understand intersectional and overlapping systems, narratives assist in revealing the realities that lie behind the experience. Narratives are indeed a decolonial project. Tell your story. For intersectional researchers interested in tracing multiple modes of oppression and material structural domination, it is potentially productive to conceptualize individual narratives as multidimensional and as comprised of multiple analytical layers in which the story told is an interaction. As we all know that intersectionality challenges narrative modes of inquiry to find analytical ways of engaging with experiences of individuals through their individual stories. Bringing narrative inquiry and intersectionality together is important in my research, as the many systems of hierarchy that were historically created are still experienced and navigated by people. So my theoretical framework in my PhD is taking an intersectionality work. Experience-centered narratives is pertinent for critical work that requires an interrogation and reflection of social positions of both the researcher and the collaborator, reflecting different social identities which are not rigid. So I went to the field with the idea of how narratives work, of course, from the literature that I've read, as well as the limitations of the methodology of narratives. But little did I know that my collaborators, which were the students I work with in the project, would actually change how they wanted to interact, how they wanted to tell their stories. So some wanted to have a conversation driven by themselves, while others preferred to send poems or pictures telling their university experience with written narratives. That was not part of the proposal. That was not part of the theory or the literature I engaged with when I was choosing my methodology. What does that mean? It means that the methodology itself then had to be redesigned and be relooked at by the collaborators, because what mattered in the research was their stories, and what matters is how they wanted to share their stories in my research. So that was the beginning of our co-creation and collaboration. So this led to a new methodology that is narrative photo voice methodology, which represents an innovative approach that integrates elements of both photo voice and narrative inquiry, thereby fostering a greater sense of ownership to the collaborators over the narrative and promoting collaborative engagement. This synthesis of methodologies enhanced a participatory nature of the research process by facilitating a greater sense of collaboration between myself and the students that I work with. And that is why the students in my research are referred to as collaborators rather than merely participants, which is a term that typically implies involvement in a pre-established project. They formed my methodology, but also they formed the methods that I was using. The most important thing is that because of the reshaping of my methodology and the ways in which I carried the research in the field, it required a sense of reflection on the chosen space that a student wanted to tell their story, which was at their power, the time in which they wanted to share their stories. But also, it made me to be mindful of the triggers that my research could have that I never thought of as I was applying for, ethical clearance, which is the only time us as researchers actually go back to think, am I being ethical? Okay, if I'm being confident using pseudonyms, anonymous, that is me being ethical. I argue that is not the gist of ethics, that ethics is also about self-check-in of the researcher in the field, but also being in tune and understanding the triggers of the research. One interesting story was I went to so I am working with 4 universities in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. And I went to one university in South Africa, which is a historically Black university, Walter Sisulu University. And when I went there was one research collaborator who was not necessarily invited through the formal processing of how do you invite a person to become part of your study. So she approached me saying that, listen, I've been hearing that you've been talking to people about their experience in higher education, and I wanted to have a conversation with you. And I was like, okay. I gave them a brief of why I am asking these questions in their university, and also asked if it is okay for me to record our conversation. But halfway in the conversation, I realized that there's an emotional trigger that's coming up, and this is a trigger warning to the people who are here, as they started speaking about the previous sexual violence that they experienced at home and how being in university was an escape for them from home. In that space and time, a researcher in me was gone. A human in me kicked in. So I stopped the recording without doing what ethics tells us to do, where you ask a person if they are okay continuing. But as a human, I didn't feel comfortable focusing on these many papers. Instead, I focused on the emotions and engaged with the emotions of the collaborator. That sent me back as well emotionally, as I was triggered as well. So I had to take a step back from the field to breathe and also to debrief with my supervisors, with my colleagues, with my peers, in terms of some of the issues that I was facing in the field, but also to do self-check-in, because in the same space, I was not received the same way that I thought I would be received. We often say we do research that is relatable and that we are relatable as researchers. But when I went there were so many privileges that I was not aware of as a researcher. One, I come from a historically white university, which is Rhodes University. Two, I come as a PhD candidate in a space with undergraduate students who are still trying to navigate the university. Three, I came with documents that were written in English, whereas I was telling my collaborators they can respond to me in isiXhosa. That was a moment of reflection for me, and that made me to go back to that same institution so that I can do it right, to have proper conversation that are co-creating, but also to navigate my power and privilege as I get into the field. Hence, I speak about positionality as navigating one's power and privilege, not only on paper as you are reflecting, but also as you are going into the field to navigate your positionality. As you are going into the field as one of the people that are researched, who is doing research about themselves, to also navigate their positionality in that process. So the research methods were designed by the collaborators as they submitted poems and photos. And I will read as part of my conclusion one of the poems that one of the collaborators submitted. But also it was important for me in this co-creation project to actually decolonize the way of research that you go to the field, you take information from people that we work with, and then you come and analyze it, and that is it. You are an analytical eye into the research. But also, I did a workshop with my collaborators, a workshop that changed my findings. I remember in the workshop, there was a poem that was gender-centered, and this poem was written in isiXhosa, and I had to translate it for the purposes of international readers as well, or people who don't understand isiXhosa. And as I was presenting my findings in the workshop, one of the collaborators corrected me, and it was a long debate, long discussion of how I actually gendered in the translation of that poem. And of course, we know there's loss of meaning in translation, but that was a moment for me to learn as well, to unlearn as well and relearn, as that collaborator changed the translation so that it can be gender inclusive. So that particular segment of workshopping has assisted in terms of strengthening the things that I'm discussing in my project, but also to ensure that I have actually represented the stories of my collaborators well. So I went to the field with no research questions, but only one question. And that was my conversation starter, that I spoke about, the conversation of just asking, tell me about your experience in the university. It is the most difficult thing to do when you go to the field because it depends on the person you are having a conversation with. But because there were not set interview questions, it allowed the conversations to flow naturally. It allowed the conversation to flow in the direction of the collaborator. So as a researcher, the only thing I played mostly in the research field was a listening ear, a conversational ear. But that also led to the idea of how the project then became a project of healing. In the co-creation, in decolonizing work or decolonization, there is healing. So I will close off with this idea of, which is one of my themes in my PhD research, that Asiphe Mxalisa, a conversation I had with a collaborator. In translation in English, we are breathing through the wounds. Asiphe Mxalisa. We are breathing through the wounds. It was introduced in a television advertisement by Outsurance Vehicle in South Africa in 2019, coinciding with a trigger warning, with the tragic murder of Miss Oyinene Mqwetyane, a 19-year-old student at the University of Cape Town, who was brutally murdered and sexually assaulted at a post office. So we do research while having our own wounds. But most importantly, when we're doing decolonizing or decoloniality research, we also trigger wounds to the collaborators we work with some research that we do. So it is important to debrief. It is important to self-check our positionality, our power, our privileges, and remember the human behind that data that we are gathering. There is a human behind the social research that we are gathering. And this is a research design that I worked with from the invitation up to the sending of transcriptions, the workshops, the conversation, and also the telling of the stories. So as I end it off, I would like to read a poem by a collaborator I worked with, who is Abongile, The Performance of Queerness. As an act we supposedly need to put together to show our togetherness, our being, who you are part of, a performance of belonging. We learn most about who we are, not from those who got us here. In fact, we mostly hide it from them. Who we are has and have always been erased, but that's another story. We learn from those who dare to put themselves in the public eye. Queerness as a brand, not a person. The heteronormative society stole what belongs to people as just expression to a role, a standard. There's a way femininity should look like. There's a way masculinity should look like. A mirror of binaries. Gender nonconforming and trans people need to perform those roles to pass, to be seen as real or whatever. A good friend of mine calls it the performance of femininity for her to pass. There's an image to look up to. I want to urge queer people to liberate ourselves from this performance, from the queer brand, to know that you don't need to become what you're told to see, but to be who you are. Energy is an expression. Let it flow with its flaws. Be who you are, the way you are. Curtains closed, stage lights off. And this is a gender non-conforming collaborator who is now undergoing a full transition and is recording their process to that transition. And that was a part of the impact that was done by my research project. With that, colleagues and friends, that is my contribution to decolonizing methodologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asiphe. And I've got some comments. If you can just keep your camera on, that would be great. Have people got any particular questions? If you have, can you put your camera on and ask the question? So anyway, in the chat there as well, amazing work, thank you. That's all fantastic. But it would be really lovely to open up the conversation and talk about some of the things that Asiphe has told us. So why don't I start by asking this question. You talked a little bit about going back to Frantz Fanon's work, and you talked a little bit about narrative as conversation, and you mentioned a little bit about therapy. Given Frantz Fanon was a psychoanalyst, what did you take from Fanon that informed your methodology, particularly around some of these lovely concepts you've got, like a listening ear, a hearing ear, being attuned to the other, being in tune with the other? Can you just talk a little bit about that to the group, please?
Thank you very much for that question. So particularly the work that I've engaged when it comes to Fanon is that of the settler's town, the idea of a colonial design of the settler's town. Now looking at knowledge and how we perceive knowledge coming from, it is that of a colonial design. So one thing about a colonial design is that it has got instructions in terms of what things are supposed to be like. what a researcher is standing in position of the society when you're engaging with the society. So from my side was to actually rebuild a new city from the settlers' town, building a new decolonization city that is the university as a space of robust engagement, but also a space for the university intent to listen instead of offering as if they are the hegemon of knowledge. So as a researcher, to actually do the listening of your collaborators, because we design the proposal of what we want to find from the field, but that's not necessarily what the community wants to talk about. The difficulty is how do we then navigate based on our studies, what to take from that, and also what to peg and write about after our PhDs, which is another conversation. So the listening allows you to listen about what the community wants to talk about. And my community in the case was the students, to listen what the students have, because remember, I was part of the mass fall movement student community, and we viewed university in a certain way, and we wanted the university to decolonize in certain spaces. But there's a student who entered the university in 2019, viewing the university different. So when I listened, that's when I built a vast amount of discussion themes. That's when I built a vast amount of information, but also it requires one to have time. And one thing about the settlers' town and the ideas that are already designed, it doesn't have patience with time. Yes. The university doesn't have patience with time. So I had to give in a year of gathering data. I had to give in a year of doing that introspective work, working with my collaborators, because I did not like the idea of being an extractionist, to go and extract from my collaborators and to present their stories and represent their stories, which I have not lived. So yeah, so that's basically that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I really like the way that you talked about the settlers' time, because if we keep operating within the settlers' time and space dimensions, we will never be able to bring about change. One of the comments that some of my Indigenous colleagues say to me is, for us, yarning is our time, and we will keep telling the stories as long as it tells to tell the story, not the half hour that you might have designated. So I really like that. Just one other comment connected to that is your notion of what is the heart of the university, the soul of the university. I loved that phrase, and you used a notion, is the heart and the soul full of, I think you said hatred. Did you say hatred? Or I must have written that down. But you also said, does it possess a heart? What's the essence of the university? Does it possess a heart? And you wanted to explore that. Do you want to just elaborate on that point?
Okay, so I usually refer to decolonization as a project of love, and there's power in love to undo so many things, but also there's a lot of thin line between love and hate. And this is what we see often in unrests, where students are showing how unpleased they are with the system. So the university is hard for it to be saved or for it to be reconstructed. There has to be a lot of stakeholder partnerships, management, academics, students, community. As the university exists in a community, rather than university being for the community, it exists in a community, meaning the collaboration, the engagements of the university, not as this hegemonic ivory tower, but the university as part of the community that will actually reconstruct the heart of the university. Right now, what's at the heart of the university in many universities is making money. We see this even with academics' expectations of publish and perish. And because of that, the way in which we collect research is timed. It is about financing its business. So the way in which we engage with the field will be based on selfish reasons of business, but not for co-creation. And that contributes to the heart of the selfishness of the university of wanting to run itself as a business. So as researchers that are doing decolonizing work, feminist work, we ought to build a new heart of the university, to center students at the heart, to center communities at the heart, but also to center ourselves as academics Something, for example, when you speak about the heart in the ethics application process, where is the heart of the researcher that becomes triggered? What do you do when you meet a collaborator that triggers you, a collaborator that is violent to you? Do we have spaces where we go back to say, I will no longer work with our collaborators or that are coming from this region, because as a woman who is researching in that space, I'm not saying, or rather we are saying you chose this research, take it with its own risks. So the ethics process as well ought to include a reflection for the researcher, so that the researcher can actually be reflective of their work and be protected by the system as they go to the research, not only protecting the collaborator. For example, the heart. What do we mean about the heart of decolonizing research if we continue to silence our collaborators with pseudonyms? It is something that as researchers we do, because when we are doing research proposals, we never propose that we will actually ask our research collaborators if they want their names to be part of the research. How am I telling a story if I've given a pseudonym? How am I archiving a story if I've given a pseudonym? Because the business ought to protect itself. And that is the heart of the university. The university ought to protect itself. I mean, even the names of the university, I use them in my project. And I know that in the application process, I was like, I'll protect the university. So now you give the name, the university that exists in the rural area. We obviously know what that university is, but the business is always protecting itself. So that is the heart that I'm speaking about in the project that I'm interested in.
No, that's lovely. You've summarised that beautifully. I can see Sakina and Natalie have been doing work in similar areas. Natalie and Sakina, or one or the other, do you want to just
Monique also
elaborate
has
on
her, Harlow, Monique has her hand up as well.
Yes, please. Okay. Monique, who would like to go first then? I should put my glasses on so I can see.
Monique, did you want to ask your question? Because is it the same one that you typed in the chat? Oh, you're just on mute, sweetheart.
You're can't hear you.
Yeah, Monique, we cannot hear you. You're just on mute.
Okay, is that better?
Yes, that is perfect. Thank you.
Sorry about my camera; it's a bit weird.
It's all good.
Yeah, look, that was very much aligned with the research that I'm doing, and I'm a non-Indigenous person who works with a number of Indigenous students as co-researchers about what the co-researchers thought about gifted education. And what came up again and again was the co-researchers wanted their names, faces, everything on every single step of the way. And I really battle with that in ethics, because there has to be some autonomy from the co-researchers. And ended up with the conferences that we went to, that these students wanted to come with, they wanted to present the work themselves. And the work, I think what's come from this is the work has got to come from the co-researchers. I call them the co-researchers in my particular one. And they also want to write the articles as well. Like, they want to be there every single step of the way. And I think that there is merit in that, because it's not my research, it's actually theirs. It's not mine. I just went kind of along for the ride. But I really enjoyed what you were saying. So thank you so much. So I just had a comment more than anything.
Thank you.
Really powerful statement. I don't know, I'm just going to jump in, and somebody else can jump in as well. I don't know, because I think I'm facing the same dilemma. Whose data is it? Right? Yeah. Because these people put their heart and soul into telling you stories, and if you develop a long relationship with the collaborators or the research co-workers, they will tell you very honest, genuine stories, and they want their names on those stories. But you've also been a person who has helped create the space by listening carefully, by attuning, by spending that time and energy. So how do you write it up where it's not just their data or your data, it is this co-produced piece of work? And I haven't got the answer. I'm still struggling with that. Anybody else want to jump in?
Sakina?
Hi, may I address that? So, sorry. got a baby here. He might cry at any point, and then if so, Natalie, you can come in, okay? So I think I heard you say that someone said that the university was a space for hope. Natalie, I think it's time for you to jump in. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. It kind of emerged in recent work that Sakina and I have been doing. So we did a project looking at futuring for racial justice, collective futuring for racial justice. And a lot of students were actually telling us that the university seemed a safer space for them to be racially minoritized. And we were just wondering if that's something that we heard you say in your presentation, that the university for a lot of your participants was a space for hope for them, whereas it's quite different outside the university space.
Thank you very much for that question and also for the comments. So in the context of South Africa, colonialism was racially based. The structures, the system was racially based. And unfortunately, that racial legacy is still systematic. It's still structural in our country. And that is something that we constantly battle with. I mean, if you can read the newspaper articles of some of the racism that is taking place, you wouldn't believe that these things are taking place in a democratic state. So the safety, my objective understanding when I went to the field was the university is not a safe space. And when I engaged with my collaborators, they regarded the university as a safe space for them to express who they are, their sexual identities. But also the other thing was a safe space to escape from their home drama and escape from the communities they come from, simply because of the structure of colonialism, where they come from, where there's no access to information, where there's no access to the internet, where there's issues of social class inequalities. So it was based on that. But on the racial question, though, one of the findings was that for as much as there are policies in higher education in South Africa, as well as the South African Constitution against racism, what students experience, particularly in the historically white universities, it is that of racial microaggression. The racism that you cannot see, the racism that you cannot touch, the racism that you cannot prove. And how do we then engage about racial microaggression on a policy perspective? How do we engage about racial microaggression on a practice perspective? So those are the things that they are experiencing. So you find a student saying, I've never experienced direct racism in the university, but I was told by one of the students in class that I can't wear white bra because I'm too dark to wear white bra, for example. So then what happens in that is the policies in university that interacts when it comes to racial microaggressions, the way in which the ivory tower of the university is designed, that is a colonial structure. So you find that even the people that are driving the engine of this racial structure are actually Black leaders who are being put in a space that already has colonial legacy. So those are the things that we are facing. So it becomes a safe space for them to express their identities because, of course, other people cannot fully express themselves in communities because of culture, because of religion. But when they stay alone and they see other students coming from different diverse backgrounds, then they can express their identities. And that's where they start navigating so many of their identities. Is the university in support of such identities? That is a question for another day, because there's just too much that universities haven't actually reformed when it comes to their transformation policies to open up the space for diverse communities. Yes.
Thank you for that, Asiphe. Sorry, I'm just going to quickly go to a question by Tasha. Tasha, if you unmute your mic, do you want to just explain your own question?
And then maybe after that, if we have time, Sue, can you also do yours? Because I see your hands up as well.
Hi. Yes, I just, first of all, wanted to thank you for such a comprehensive presentation around narrative inquiry, and I really appreciated that. One of the things that I was wondering is that given, and I think there was other comments that said the same thing by Natalie and Sakina, but just given some of the constraints of our institutions around the time-consuming work this is, what kinds of things do you suggest for us that are interested in doing this kind of work to do in order to navigate that? And also, how have you found you have needed to sort of validate this work, or have you needed to validate this work? And if so, in what ways do you do that?
I think for me, it was also being honest. There was a time that I was stuck in the field because I didn't know how to represent the stories I was receiving from the field. I wasn't comfortable with the ways in which I was asking the questions. You know, you'd meet a collaborator that is just a person that doesn't like talking, and you have to go back and ask follow-up questions. And I'm just like, but narratives is saying you shouldn't ask the who's, the what, they have a lot of questions to not ask to the collaborator. And I was stuck in the field. I couldn't write up, you know, the things I was finding from the field. But then I remembered I'm still doing the PhD. It is still funded, and I need to still finish it according to certain years. So what I started doing was to just do free writing of that and packing away some of the important conversations I received, which necessarily do not contribute now to the PhD project for future projects. But the one thing that helped, though, was that I am thinking and I am working on writing a book project with my collaborators so that I can actually collaborate with them, because I'd already given them pseudonym as well, because that's what I said in the ethics application, to collaborate with them so that I actually archive their stories in a book project and co-write with them those stories, the pictures, the poems. They need to be published somewhere. And I think that is a big contribution after the PhD. So it is very important to have the support. I know the support is very important, as I mentioned in my presentation. Without Kirsten, without Sue, I wouldn't have been able to do this work. So they supported the ways in which I wanted to do research. And that helped within the resubmissions I had to do for ethics. I had to resubmit an ethics application again to say, oh, well, now I'm using pictures as well. And fortunately for me, Rhodes didn't give me any issues. They issued another ethical clearance. So I think it is important to also tell ourselves and tell our students that they can go back to their proposal, go back to their ethics and resubmit something. So if you haven't gone to the field and you would like to keep the names of your collaborators, ask them if they would like to, or rather, ask them what type of pseudonym do they want. Some people would actually put their grandmother, because they mean something to them, as their pseudonym instead of giving them numbers, A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3. So those open conversations, so that you create that comfort that they actually trust you with their stories, because you've given them a design, you've given them the power to design how this conversation will turn out. So I know it becomes a lot to sit with a lot of data, because imagine being in an open conversation. They spoke a lot of things that have got nothing to do with my research question, and I will not go back to the research question but I also still feel like those important conversations have to be somewhere. So the book project for me, the storybook project for me will be that, and it's not going to be a book project for an academic community. It will be a book project that any of them can take back to their homes so that their parents can read. So it's going to be an easy Xhosa, because most of my collaborators are from the Xhosa community, and English. It won't have any analytical theories of intersectionality lenses. It will just be them sharing their stories in a book. So I think that's how I've navigated it. But I did have a year of being stuck, because I'm doing a project where you are introducing a lot of new things that you also don't know, that comes from people who are not in the academic other side of the space, which are students, was a tricky point. And that took me about a year of not knowing what to do now. So I was like, was I being overambitious? And how do I navigate my ambition as well, so that I finish my PhD? So hopefully I'm finishing it this year. And yay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I love the idea of a book, and we look forward to reading that as well. And sorry, my camera's not working, but thank you.
Thanks, Tasha. Sue, did you want to have the final word? And then we'll have to close up.
Yep, I just made it home, luckily, so I could pick the phone up and I can turn the camera on. Hi, Asiphe. Thank you so much for your presentation. When we were talking, you reminded me of something that another Fanon scholar talked about, Jane Gordon and Lewis Gordon, that they said flying high or flying low, in the end, flight has to be taken. And what they're talking about is once you start decolonisation, you can't stop, and you can't be satisfied with just a little bit of decolonising and saying, oh, well, this will do for now and we'll sit here for a while. So my question is, and I think you answered it a little bit, like in talking about how you'd like to reform ethics, but are there other things that you would like to see, which is like the next level up of decolonising methodology?
Thank you for that. I saw a comment as well that says, when you are doing this work, you must be ready to suffer. And I think that's one thing that we're not ready for, because this work is not going to be received with open arms. And that goes with the support, and it emotionally destroys the researcher. It has emotionally destroyed me in the space being triggered by the stories. But I think the decolonizing methodologies, what I'm looking forward to is to actually going back to indigenous knowledge of doing things, even with science, the experiments, the conversations, and write up about those things so that other researchers can actually be able to then use these methodologies in their research. I was actually triggered by this idea of what is the bigger contribution in the PhD. And I was like, sometimes the bigger contribution is not for waiting for government to actually do the difference, waiting for government to actually take your project and respond, or waiting for the university to actually introduce decolonizing methodology as part of the methodology, but how it actually impacted back to the people that I was working with. So that is the bigger contribution of the research. So I am hoping that we actually continue building not only the methodology, because what we're trying to do is to find synonyms of what semi-structured interview is, and then we take it to my language, isiXhosa, which is conversation, and then we use that instead of semi-structured, but redesigning methods, participatory methods for the communities that we are engaging with, that we are working with. And also, I hope that from the decolonizing methodologies, we actually try and do away with so many documents that we take to Indigenous people, particularly illiterate people, that we take documents to sign, and we are told they can sign in a certain way and stuff, because that is a beginning of an uncomfortable power dynamic conversation. And that affects even the data that one gets, because obviously you came in as this powerful person from the institution with this particular documents to sign, multiple documents to sign, and finding alternative ways for giving consent, verbal consent from the people that we're engaging with, particularly if they are of age to consent to have conversations with the researcher. So I'm looking forward to the build up as well as the development of decolonizing methodologies, because there's not much literature on it. And the literature that I've seen is actually basically finding synonyms of the westernized methodologies that we already have. Perhaps in the design of the ways in which we carry research, then that's how we introduce, additions to the methodology, back to the methodology itself.
Thank you so much, Asiphe. That is brilliant. I hope that this little forum has been supportive for you and your work, and you consider us part of your support network as well. Can everybody join me in thanking Asiphe for her fantastic talk and the brilliant work she's doing? And we look forward to hearing more about your research. So please stay in touch.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for this robust engagement. Do have the rest of the evening from your side well, and I'll start my day because it's now 9 a.m. in South Africa.
Thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for this.
Thank you, everybody, for participating. Bye. Thanks, Kelly.